Hi, thank you for welcoming us. Our topic today is going to be to speak about cognitive behavior therapy and the applications that we use for families living with autism spectrum disorder. Two programs today we're going to be talking about. One is the Positive Adult Developmental Program and a Facing Your Fears program. But some introductions. My name is Pat LeClaire. I am a child and youth worker as well as a registered psychotherapist here in Toronto. I have worked with Autism Discoveries Child and Family Center for the last 28 years in several other mental health areas. And my special interest is in integrating cognitive behavior therapy into our autism work that we do here.
Hi there, my name is Chantal Patterson and I am an intake worker in the autism department here at Autism Discoveries. I have had the pleasure of working with this agency in different capacities since 2005, and I had begun my career here as an intensive behavior therapist, providing one-to-one therapy to children on the spectrum, then was a family support coach where this allowed me the opportunity to work with parents and caregivers directly, and in 2015 became an intake worker. I am also a child and youth worker, and I'm passionate in working with families to provide them the tools to support their children to reach their potential and to help improve the family's quality of life. I'm very grateful to be in this position, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity today to speak with you about some of our programs. So thank you so much.
So a little bit about what we do here at Autism Discoveries. We are a children's mental health center, and we've been providing evidence-based services here in Toronto, particularly in the east end of Toronto and in one of our boroughs in Scarborough. And we have been providing the evidence-based intervention for autism spectrum disorders for around 20 years now. And our vision really is to be an environment that we're inclusive and supportive and community-oriented, where children and families can thrive. Our mission is really to engage and support children through our diverse programs and our services that help them to build skills, knowledge, and resiliency. We have several locations in the area, and we are very client focused, so we help to serve clients in their own communities. We have an early intervention program and a children's mental health program. We have day treatment programs and a residential program along with our autism program. We are one of the regional providers in Toronto. So today we're going to talk a little bit about cognitive behavior therapy.
Okay, so the programs we will be presenting today are both based on cognitive behavior therapy and positive psychology. So before we jump into the Positive Adult Development Program and the Facing Your Fears program, we are going to spend some time exploring cognitive behavior therapy, positive psychology, and what cognitive distortions are. So let's begin here with cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. So what exactly is CBT? So CBT is a psychotherapy based on modifying everyday thoughts and behavior with the aim of positively influencing emotions. The way we feel is a result of our thoughts and our innermost beliefs that will translate into our actions. So at times, we hold inaccurate perceptions that are a result of past experiences. The idea around CBT is not to dwell on the past, but to challenge those perceptions by replacing them with accurate beliefs to overcome anxiety. A strong emphasis with CBT is homework, which can involve keeping a diary of the events and associated feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and to challenge those unhelpful thoughts that are perpetuating the anxiety. To overcome anxiety, these situations must be confronted and not avoided, and Pat will be highlighting some of those techniques used to face anxiety a little later on today. So in a nutshell, CBT will allow you to gradually face anxiety-provoking situations that were once avoided. So before we take a look at some examples of those thought diaries, let's explore the components that create and maintain anxiety. So looking at this visual representation, we begin with an anxiety-provoking situation, which triggers the cycle of anxiety involving our thoughts, emotions, behavior, and physical reactions. And we also recognize that environment plays a role. So here we have a situation which can either be an internal or an external trigger. An internal trigger can be an unpleasant emotion, perhaps a thought about an upcoming event you may be dreading, or a physical reaction. So we've got our increased heart rate, for instance, or muscle tension as examples, whereas an external trigger can be any future event that worries you. This may be a school gathering, social gathering rather, or perhaps a meeting with your child's school. So let's explore our diagram a little further here. So the situation listed is being criticized at work. So in response to our situation, a thought pops into our mind. We will refer to this thought as an automatic thought, a concept in CBT. This trigger, this event, rather, triggers the automatic thought, I'm not good enough. As a result, this has me feeling worthless and anxious, which translates into isolation and avoidant behaviors. My body's physical reaction to the situation causes me to feel tired, and a loss of appetite is also noted. These physical reactions can cause negative interpretations of self and the world. So I mentioned that one aspect of CBT is to keep a thought diary. So let's take a look at one now. So keeping a diary of upsetting or anxiety-provoking situations will allow individuals to understand how thoughts contribute to the emotional state, which translates into behaviors. So there are a variety of thought diaries available online, but this one here is nice and simple to use. So we would begin filling out the chart by writing down the event. So something happens. Next, I tell myself something. Then I feel something, and lastly, I do something. So we've got the thoughts, the feelings, and the behaviors. So it's important to highlight that it's okay to have these feelings, whether it's guilt or anger or worry. It's our thoughts that are maladaptive, not our feelings. So emotions are difficult to change directly, but we can target and change the way we feel by changing our thoughts. And when we change our thoughts, because all the components are connected, our behavior changes. So for some individuals, targeting the behavior instead of intervening at the thoughts can also be effective. So here's a look at another thought diary. This one allows the writer to identify their feelings using a rating system before and after using alternative or helpful thoughts. So with a rating of 0 to indicate an absence of intensity and 10 representing the highest of intensity. So we would begin to fill out our diary the same as the one on the previous slide, starting with the situation. Then we would list the thought that brought about the strong emotion, then provide a rating in the feelings column. The next column is our alternative thoughts. So how do we identify these alternative thoughts? This is where we look for facts or evidence that support the automatic or the hot thought. There's no room for opinion here, just strictly sticking to the facts. So some questions to pose to yourself could be, what is another way to view the situation? Is the way that I'm thinking helpful? If my friend had this thought, what would I say to them? Am I jumping to conclusions that are not completely justified by the evidence? So after we've examined this evidence, we write a more balanced or alternative thought. Then finally, we provide a rating based on that alternative thought that we've identified. Changing one's thinking is certainly a process that requires a lot of patience and practice. We can actually restructure the way the brain is wired, and over time, one can begin to think in a more balanced way. We don't want our baseline to always be at a 10. Being at a 10 means our bodies are getting stuck in the fight or flight pattern, and we don't want our bodies to get stuck. This is chronic stress and can lead to numerous health problems. So it's not about getting you to a 0, but moving from a 10 to a 4 means we're actually challenging our thinking, and anxiety is decreasing. That's what we're moving right along to positive psychology. Positive psychology is a relatively new domain in the field of psychology and is the science of what makes life worth living. There is positive and positive thinking. Positive emotions are linked with better health, longer life, and greater well-being. On the other hand, chronic anger, worry, and hostility increase the risk of developing heart disease. For some people, being happy comes naturally and easily, while others need to work at it. So how does one go about becoming happier? That's where positive psychology comes in and explores how people can support the quest for increased satisfaction and meaning. So Dr. Martin Seligman is considered the father of positive psychology, and his focus is building upon what is already positive in our lives as a means to living a more joy-filled, satisfying life. He says that there are 3 routes to happiness, which all can be learned, or 3 dimensions, a progression, if you will. The first one being experiencing positive emotions, or the pleasant life. This is when we can focus on the positive in our lives and finding the day-to-day things to be grateful for. So these can be those short-term pleasures. It can be as simple as, that new shirt that you bought or the coffee that you just drank. So we can remain there, or we can move to engagement or the good life. So being engaged speaks to being so engrossed in an activity that you completely lose track of time. This is when we can recognize and capitalize on our strengths and apply them to other areas of our lives, whether it be in our parenting or in our work. So remaining in the engaged or the good life enhances our lives. Now this sounds great, but there's still one step further, the meaningful life. So this is when we find a deep sense of fulfillment or satisfaction while using our strengths for a purpose greater than ourselves. Finding something that takes you outside of yourself that gives your life meaning. Helping, inspiring, enriching the lives of others. So now let's explore some of the things that can have an impact on our happiness. Cognitive distortions. So cognitive distortions are biased perspectives we take on ourselves and the world around us. They are emotional thoughts and feelings and beliefs that we unknowingly reinforce over time. Cognitive distortions are simply ways that our mind convinces us of something that really isn't true. These inaccurate thoughts are usually used to reinforce negative thinking or emotions, telling ourselves things that sound rational and accurate, but really only serve to keep us feeling bad about ourselves. So cognitive distortions are at the core of what many cognitive behavioral and other kinds of therapists try to help a person learn to change in psychotherapy. So by learning to correctly identify this kind of thinking, we can then answer the negative thinking back and prove it wrong. When we continue to debunk this negative thinking over and over again, it will slowly diminish over time and will be automatically replaced by more rational, balanced thinking. So let's explore some of the common cognitive distortions, beginning with the all or nothing thinking. So this is when we tend to see things in terms of extremes, very black or white thinking or concrete thinking. We are unable to see those shades of gray. So for example, this is when we're saying it's always like this or it never goes right. The next one being overgeneralization, which can lead to overly negative thoughts about oneself based on only 1 or 2 experiences. This is when we think, every time I do this, this happens, or it will never end. The mental filter focuses on a single negative and excludes all the positive.
Like, I could,
A parent dwelling on a
I could
negative
print out
comment
those things,
on
deal with it,
their
yeah,
past
yeah.
child is having a tantrum at a shop while ignoring all the positive comments made by friends and family. Disqualifying positive acknowledges positive experiences but rejects them instead of embracing them. This can be applied to a parent who may be having a difficult day today, but dismissing that how they have managed other difficult days or incidents in the past. Jumping to conclusions can involve two aspects. The first would involve the inaccurate belief that we know what the other person is thinking or mind reading. And the second would fall under fortune telling. This would refer to the tendency to make conclusions and predictions based on little to no evidence and holding them as the truth. So an example of mind reading would be that same parent managing their child's tantrum in the store and a passerby observing the family with an unpleasant expression on their face. The parent automatically jumps to the conclusion the patron must be thinking, wow, they are a bad parent. And fortune telling is simply jumping to conclusions that, for instance, their child will never be toilet trained because they are not toilet trained by now. So seeing prediction as fact. Magnification and minimization. So magnification involves exaggerating the importance or meaning of things. So for example, making a mistake and instead of letting it go, we interpret this mistake as being an awful parent. Or the opposite, minimizing the importance of meaning of things. This would happen when a parent may discount all the positives they've done up to this point that have contributed to their child's development, such as accessing programs, treatments, may still believe they are an awful parent. Emotional reasoning refers to the acceptance of one's emotions as facts. This can be described as, I feel it, therefore it must be true. So I feel like I'm a bad parent, therefore it must be true. Should statements are the statements that we make about ourselves about what we should do, what we ought to do, or what you must do, which often results in feelings of guilt. Should statements can also be applied to others, imposing a set of expectations that will likely not be met. We are generally disappointed by the failure of the others to meet our expectations, leading to anger and resentment. Labeling and mislabeling are extreme forms of overgeneralization in which we assign judgments to ourselves or to others based on one experience. So, for example, seeing a child in the community that may be having a difficult time in expressing, well, that child has autism too. And finally, we have personalization. And this is when we take everything personally and believe we are to blame for situations that are well beyond our control. So let's take a look at a thought diary example provided by a parent and how cognitive distortions had an impact. So here we are. We have the event that brought the mother to her automatic or her hot thought. This is when her child's bus was late dropping him from school. So we see here that she jumped to conclusions with no evidence to support her thought. She believed the bus must have been in an accident to be so late. So at this point, mother is feeling anxious, worried, and panicked. She begins to pace, calls the dispatch, and begins to yell. So at this point, her rating, not viewed here, was at a 9. So when she was able to explore other possibilities, coming up with those alternative thoughts, she identified that traffic as a reasonable explanation for the bus being late. And if anybody's ever traveled to Toronto, we know that that's a strong possibility. So with keeping traffic in mind, she actively identified a helpful thought. She would wait 15 minutes before calling the dispatch. So replacing her hot thought with a helpful thought, had her still feeling, slightly worried, but instead of calling the dispatch to yell, she practiced the progressive muscle relaxation exercises that she learned the week before, and in turn, she was able to relax herself and save that call to the dispatch. So her rating was at a 9 and was reduced to a 3. So we can see here that when mother was able to flip her thoughts and actively think about an alternative thought, this was reflected in her behavior, which prevented that confrontational call to the dispatch. So taking the distorted thoughts and flipping them to helpful thinking will change our behavior, which will change our interactions with others, which will have a positive impact on our relationships. So when we looked at the thought diary example just shared, mother was able to interrupt her hot thought, replacing it with more rational and balanced thinking, which eliminated the call to the dispatch. And we want to interrupt the cognitive distortion of the thought pattern. So by engaging in more neutral and balanced ways of thinking, we can stop the vicious cycle involving negative thoughts by CBT provides an effective tool to help break negative patterns. So if we do this, we will be well on our way towards being able to replace the negative thoughts with ones that help us rather than hurt us.
Yeah.
Getting stuck with these negative thoughts cause us to feel worthless, anxious, depressed, feel inferior, dismiss our personal growth, and keeps us stuck in the past rather than progressing in the future, which can make parenting more challenging. Just feel the consequences can lead to lower self-esteem, reduced productivity, increased anxiety, contribute to depression, and stress. So up to this point, we have explored CBT and positive psychology, cognitive distortions, which are all common amongst both the Positive Adult Development Program and Facing Your Fears program. So the treatment approach we use at our agency, as Pat mentioned, is evidence-based, using cognitive behavior therapy to support families reframe their thoughts and to decrease their stress level, which leads us to our Positive Adult Development Program, which is also referred to as PAD. So it is an evidence-based program and was created to help parents or of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So PAD incorporates evidence-based interventions from the field of positive psychology and emphasizes moves to temper emotions. The curriculum and exercises are derived from best practices, which include advocacy training, parent-to-parent emotional support, service delivery understanding, parent-child interactions, and cognitive behavioral approaches that reduce the negative thinking and enhances effective problem-solving skills. So this program was developed at Vanderbilt's Kennedy Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. So the PAD program is a 6-week program at 1.5 hours per session. As you can see, each week we explore different aspects as it relates to parenting and ways to move beyond the stage where caregivers may feel stuck. This is an emotionally heavy program, especially during the first 3 sessions when participants are beginning to identify their stressors. Parenting is stressful, and we certainly know parenting a child with autism have additional stressors. Factors in which stressors are perceived vary widely by one's personality, coping habits, along with a host of other factors. A large component to the Positive Adult Development Program is to give caregivers, is to have caregivers change their perceptions and reframe their thoughts. Reframing involves identifying unhelpful thoughts and replacing them with more positive or adaptive ones. Now, it takes time to retrain our brain, but once we begin to see things in a different way, we can build up momentum. So how we think impacts our feelings and behaviors. If our thoughts are always negative, this can start a negative cycle. But if we can change our thoughts to more positive ones, you'll see that your feelings and behavior will also follow. Having positive thoughts will help build positive interactions. So each session piggybacks onto the next, beginning with week 1, from control to letting go. So during this session, we spent a lot of time discussing stress and the impact it has on our bodies. Often we experience high levels of stress, not over the situation itself, but the inability to control a situation. So we have the participants of the program identify their stressors out of their control, and our hope for the week is to take steps towards letting it go by practicing the strategies covered during the session. The second week focuses on grief to acceptance. So everyone is unique. We're all independent with our own stories, and every one of us hold a different set of experiences. With this in mind, receiving a diagnosis of autism can have caregivers experience emotions. One of those emotions families may experience is grief. So some families, not all, may grieve the loss of the original dream they had for their child. So of course, we as parents will continue to have goals and dreams, but it's when those goals and dreams change, one can experience grief. It was once believed that we all experience the grieving process in the same order. We know that this is not true. No one goes through the stages in the same order or experience them with the same intensity. So we talk about how grieving can be triggered at any time, for instance, as developmental milestones are missed or achieved, and we can slip back into a former stage of grief that we may thought we had overcome. The important piece around grieving is to recognize and to limit the time we spend at any one stage. So recognizing this grief is an important aspect to healing. So in building new dreams comes acceptance, and in using positive psychology comes acceptance. So this session focuses on exactly that, grief to acceptance. Now, the third week, as the title suggests, we discuss some of the guilt, the involved, and the importance around forgiveness. So we ask our families, is there someone you're angry with? Is it the doctor who didn't realize the child's diagnosis sooner? A parent for not accepting the diagnosis? So carrying around thoughts of anger and resentment can be debilitating. Forgiving others, whether they deserve it or not, is for our benefit, not theirs. So we provide strategies to practice forgiveness and work through scenarios using the cognitive behavior therapy model. Week 4, so conflict to collaboration. So this session focuses on sources of conflict and by making changes in our behavior, how this can lead to better collaboration. We also focus on uncovering hidden strengths and using character strengths as a means to reducing stress and increasing happiness. Week 5, from fear to confidence. During this week's session, we focus on fears. We talk about healthy fears versus unhealthy fears and how we can shift our thinking and to build that confidence. Self-care is explored in addition to progressive muscle relaxation and mindfulness, which are two components that complement CBT so well. And then finally, our last session brings us to pessimism to optimism. So this session focuses on benefits and steps toward optimism, which in turn supports positivity. So the purpose of the program is really to learn strategies to cope and to manage stress. It provides families parent support and connecting with other families, and of course identifying and using those character strengths in new ways and practicing gratitude, forgiveness, and grace and optimism. So now that we have covered the Positive Adult Development Program, I'm going to pass you along to Pat, where she will discuss the Facing Your Fears program.
So the second program that we use here at our center is called Facing Your Fears. The authors are Judy Raven, Audrey Blakely-Smith, Shana Nichols, and Susan Helpburn. They are the researchers and authors of this fantastic program. It is an evidence-based, manualized cognitive behavior therapy program that teaches families how to help their children face their anxieties that have interrupted their daily lives. So what we know about anxiety is that out of all the psychiatric disorders, children with anxiety disorders occurs the most. And we also know that anxiety disorders also have a high comorbidity rate with other disorders such as mood disorders, behavior disorders, and development disorders such as Autism Spectrum Disorder. This population is more at risk for developing clinical anxiety disorders, which often interferes with their daily life. It can interrupt school participation, learning, and later affect the ability to of employment, and will often lead to other factors such as. So we know from the research that CBT is an effective for anxiety disorder. The most effective, though, is CBT in conjunction with medication. So this portion
with this voice. Doesn't matter. She was like, yeah. And she's.
So the types of anxiety that this particular program addresses well are, clients who have difficulty with separation anxiety from their parents or from home or uh, grandparents. Um, the other anxiety is about specific phobias and the simple fears of life, being afraid to walk down into the basement, being afraid to sleep in a room by yourself, common everyday occurrences that really interrupt functioning levels. Generalized anxiety disorder is another one, but it's often better to have a specific kind of phobia to target during the program. And social phobias are also um, ones to look at for this program. What this program does not cover is obsessive compulsive disorders and panic attacks. Those have different kind of treatment modalities. Not that it doesn't work, but this particular program just does not address that at this point. So a large part of this program, the focus really is to train the parents to be coaches to their children, so that they continue to do this piece of work in their everyday lives. This is a 14-week program. We run it for an hour and a half each session. And each of the sessions, second half of the program, is really to support parents in practicing exposures with their children. And then we give them feedback, which they can apply to practicing at home. A big part of CBT in general is about homework, so we check in with parents each week to look at some of the highlights of the homework, what worked well, what needs new strategies, and parents and children both become very comfortable talking about their progress at home. There's variance in the way that this program is run. There are particular parts of the group where it's both parent and children together. Then there's a section where it's just the children's group alone. And then there's an opportunity for parents to meet on their own with each other and to provide support for each other. And in the children's group, they also get that same opportunity. So the first half of the program, so the first 6-7 weeks, is really defining and identifying anxiety in their bodies and building up and developing those coping skills to help them later on manage the anxiety. The second half of the program is really to identify the specific goals and the creation of the hierarchies, and applying the coping skills that they learned in the first 7 weeks, and to begin a graduated exposure in parent coaching. The program also offers a booster session, which occurs 46 weeks after the last session has occurred, and where the graduated exposure in vivo training occurs. So some of the coping skills that we address are listed here. But let's talk a little bit about parental participation. Here focuses on understanding the anxiety systems of their own child, and they begin to use the same language at home in the contents of this group with the overall goal of symptom reduction. This particular group is very clear in outlining the fact that anxiety is something that is treatable and can reduce symptoms, but its goal is to not completely take all the anxiety away, although that does happen sometimes. The goal is symptom reduction here. So, one of the ways we teach this program is by using reinforcement, and we know that reinforcement is used to help strengthen a desired outcome. We start often with external reinforcers, sometimes with edibles, sometimes with activities, sometimes with, parent time together. And this is to help them participate and move them to later on more internal reinforcers. We do that by pairing the external tangible reinforcers with adult praise so that when we fade out the tangible reinforcers, the praise alone will work to reinforce a specific behavior. False alarms. False alarms is a really big part of this program. Identifying an alarm as an anxiety symptom and how it manifests itself different for every person. For some, they've identified heart racing, sweating, behavior, or we know for some kids it comes across as acting out, especially when they're triggered by an event or a perceived unrealistic event. So a false alarm, how we teach it is, a false alarm is alarms that is set off in the body unnecessarily. For example, when we're walking down the street, you see a tiger. You would choose fight or flight. I personally would run. The alarm automatically goes off, and my coping strategy just kicks in. A false alarm is when that alarm goes off, there's no tiger present. There never had been. It's a perceived unrealistic event. So the job of CBT really is to teach people how to calm those false alarms and how to sort out what is realistic and what is false. So the children in the group start to use this right from the beginning, and it's a major part of the teaching of the coping skills. So active minds is the next strategy. Our thoughts that are responsible to the false alarms are thoughts that bring on a false alarm. Really is what an active mind is. And when we were looking at the CBT behavior diary, the thinking column is really what the active minds is. So an example could be, I hate snakes, therefore you avoid going to the zoo. But what we want to do is replace that active mind with a helpful thought. And turning that into, although I do not enjoy snakes, they are safely behind the glass and will not hurt me. A helpful thought can help or change our emotion, which in turn helps our physical reaction, just like we saw in the behavior diary. Understanding the mind-body connection can be also used as coping skills instead of an emotional response. So we talk a little bit about the body. We talk about where people feel anxiety and how it's manifested. So some children identify it as crying. Some identify it as acting out. Some identify as withdrawing or being quiet, and some the total opposite of being very loud. So we talk about this, and we talk about it so that everybody in the family can understand that at that moment that child's being triggered by a certain anxiety that they did not think was connected previously, which really is. So what we call some of these triggers are worry bugs. So our worry bug is really it's a term to externalize the actual worry so that it helps to communicate with the family that something has been triggered. And when we could do that, we can respond in a different way. So often we use examples like, I'm feeling scared, but this is just my worry bug trying to trick my body. What we combat it with is a helper bug. children make their own bugs as a manifestation of what their helper bug is. A lot of times, the helper bugs are superheroes, and those superheroes help to defeat the worry bugs. The plan to get to green is the last strategy, and it is really to measure a pre and post, how a child is feeling before they apply the coping skill, and then a measurement of how they are feeling after. So the plan to get to green is really to be able to get to go from a 0 to, let's say, uh, a number 8, and back from a number 8 back down to 0. So hierarchies and exposures. A hierarchy is really a list of all the fears that that a child has, and the child and the parents together rate between 1 and 10, going from the lowest to highest, and they are used then to create the exposure. So gradual exposure is really beginning to use that anxiety towards a positive outcome, a little tiny bit at a time. So one of the stimuli on the hierarchy is focused on over the next several weeks and used to practice each step on the exposure. So graded exposure, it's comprised of a couple of psych terms we use here in autism therapy. So graded exposure is really facing the fear a little bit at a time, and affirming the counter conditioning and desensitization. The fear is reduced by adding a pleasant stimulus to anxiety-provoking stimuluses. You confront the fear and change the biological response that it makes it incompatible. So we add the pleasant stimulus of a reward, as tangible or praise, or both combined. When an anxiety stimulus changes the response, it is weakened for the child, assuming much more ready to move on to next. Exposure should be daily, temporarily, at least 20 minutes at a time. And that is how long it takes an average person to recover from a feeling of panic or anxiety. So we want to stay with that for the full 20 minutes, so that it helps then to de-escalate other anxiety. And if you want to soon, then you run the risk of creating an escape behavior you don't want. So the second part is extinction. Extinction is the unconditioned response that does not follow the conditioned stimuli that it did previously. So we habituate when we stay with the fear until the stimulus does not produce that high biological arousal response. So when we do that, cognitive changes begin to occur. The generalization occurs because the brain reinterprets the situation, and a coping skill is then developed. The exposure is handled. There's increase in self-efficacy and knowledge that something is working. So the brain will then revert to that thought the next time it occurs. There is some information out there about flooding method. This particular program does not use it, although sometimes what happens during an exposure, the child does 3 exposures all in the same day and is able to move on quickly through those. We don't use flooding here, but it can occur. here is a sample of a exposure. So we are going from the least intrusive and working our way up to our last step. So we initially start the exposure with something very small, like viewing pictures of dogs. For some children, if that's not a starting point, we sit and think about dogs and or think about looking up pictures of dogs. So you can start, you can break down the steps even more. And we move up from looking at videos of fluffy dogs, looking up different kinds of dogs, then going to pet stores to look at dogs or look at dogs that are in a different room. And then we want to move on to petting the dog on the leash, off the leash, and then a large dog leash. So these exposures can take sometimes 2 or 3 weeks, and sometimes they can take 2 or 3 months. So we move at the rate of the child. We do not move forward until the child is ready to move forward. It's a very important component here. And if the program finishes before that exposure is complete, that's okay. The parents continue to practice that and continue to move at the child's pace beyond what the program is, and either come back at the booster session to talk about how they've moved or what step they're at and what they're going to continue to work on. So here is an example from the actual manual. So we have what our overall goals are. We have what our reward is going to be, our reinforcers. We have how we are going to practice. And at the bottom, we have what our coping strategies are going to be. What are we going to say to ourselves? What are our helpful thoughts? What are our coping skills that help us to move along? It's a little hard to see, but this child took presenting in front of a classroom and broke it down into small pieces, and we were able to see some progress. This child in particular didn't finish all the way to the end, but had some success with all of the steps before him. So the exposures work in a gradual way. So we see here that our first exposure, so our first practice, our anxiety still goes up pretty high and then decreases. The second, third, and fourth exposure, we experience the anxiety, but we experience it at a much less rate. And by the fourth exposure here, there is still some anxiety, but the duration of the anxiety and the intensity of the anxiety has really decreased from here. So one of the things that we teach for parents is being excessive protective. So we can, pull the child out of the anxious situation and look like first exposure and fourth exposure. So the anxiety will peak very, very high and then drop off very, very quickly at short time because we've removed the stimulus. We've applied negative reinforcement. Unfortunately, though, it never gets to the point where second and third exposures are occurring and the anxiety is decreasing. The anxiety level will always remain the same. So the outcome that we want isn't performed while taking the anxious moment away. So we teach parents that sometimes they need to pull back and intervening and wait and watch and apply some of the coping strategies and some of the techniques first, and using the pre-post measures to help them determine, what has been helpful for their own child. Outcomes. So the outcomes for, beyond the graphs, beyond the numbers, some of the outcomes that impact families directly, and the feedback that we get about this particular program is that for parents, uh, whether it's a little outcome or a big outcome, even the little outcomes make a big difference in a family's everyday life. When, we've had a lot of families come here because their child sleeping in their own bed has been a challenge, and that, we've been able to move a family and a child to be able to sleep in their bed once or even twice a week. And although it's not 7 days a week, for that parent, their stress has been reduced a couple of times a week to make it less challenging for them. So the overall goal of this particular program is to build coping skills and to apply that CBT techniques to that program. We've had many children go through this program, and a lot of real success in decreasing anxiety. So here's the pre and post measures that we use in this program, and you can see that the red line is actually measures increase in coping skills and decrease in parent stress. Here are the numbers for that graph, and for your references, here are the authors to both the Facing Your Fear programs and the Positive Adult programs. We'd like to thank you for joining us today, and hope that this session has been informative.